All right, it is just noon Central Time. I want to welcome everybody to this really important session as part of our online Earth Day conference here at the Nelson Institute. My name is Paul Robbins. I am Dean of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up for a day of learning and sharing. Let me throw some highlights out. We've got 2,500 people registered for this event coming and going from both live and pre-recorded sessions. There's, 300 of you in the room now? I think 500 some odd are registered for this session. I think it's an urgent session, and so I can see why it's so popular. I hope we're going to learn a lot today. Some other highlights to keep in mind is that the content is going to be available to you for this whole Earth Day. That is the pre-recorded stuff till about 8:30 Central Time, p.m. And then things kind of go cold. So I'd urge you to get out there and check out some of the other content and other sessions across the course of the day. It's really great stuff. I have dropped in now to several of these sessions. They've been really good. For all the pre-recorded sessions, at 3 p.m. Central Time, we're going to have a chat event where many of the people who provided the pre-recorded stuff will be available in chat rooms so that you can come in and ask them questions that you weren't able to ask them because it was a virtual instead of an actual session. So that's super cool. Show up at 3 p.m. And I hope everybody's learning something today. We're really pleased now to have a live session about how human health and the health of the planet are intricately intertwined. Professor Jonathan Patz, who's here, his remarks today just couldn't be any more timely. I can't even think of anything more important to discuss than planetary health, with everybody staying home, taking this all in from their basements. So Professor Jonathan Patz is the John P. Holton Chair and the Environment and Health in the Environment, and he's director of the Global Health Institute at UW-Madison. Dr. Patz and his team recently launched the Planetary Health Scholars Program, which was crazy prescient, it seems to me, which encourages interdisciplinary research and scholarship on this critical topic. In addition to his work at UW-Madison, Dr. Patz has also co-chaired the health expert panel of the first congressionally mandated U.S. National Assessment on Climate Change. He served as the lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. His efforts on the APCC led to an incredible honor. He is a co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Jonathan's written over 100 peer-reviewed papers, co-edited multiple textbooks on global environmental health. He's just the perfect man for the perfect moment. So before I turn this over to you, I'm just going to point out that he's going to speak for about a half hour or so, and then there's going to be a good amount of time for Q&A. So if you will have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box down there. You'll see it on the bottom right, and I will try to then read those questions out to Jonathan with the time that we have in the second half hour. So with nothing further, I'd really like to thank Dr. Patz for joining us, and you have the floor, sir.
Paul, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind presentation and introduction. And my presentation today, it's just such an honor for me to be able to give this on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day event. So I thank you for that. I just want to check with you. Can you see the slide okay?
I can see the slide okay, which means probably everybody else can too.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, before I jump into this, I just want to say that the entire campus is working hard, stepping up, using the strength of the university, rolling up their sleeves, working on modeling the epidemic and supply chains, to working on communication strategies and even databases for this new contact tracing effort, which is so huge. So everyone is stepping up. It's an incredible effort. So with that, my goal today is to really focus on preventing the next pandemic. And this cover image, by the way, has this image of mass health workers and a burning forest. Has some very special meaning for me. This was aired, this is an NBC special report aired 2 weeks ago, where in that they interviewed my former student, Amy Vitor, and talked about our study from the Amazon, looking at the link between deforestation and malaria. But more on that later. we've known for a long time the links between the environment and disease emergence. So it's not any news to this community. So today what I want to do is look at our current situation, and I want to have three focus areas. The first being on the proximate socio-environmental determinants of the newly emerged coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, which is now causing the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, the upstream causal factors, human incursion into and disruption of nature. And the last focus area is the urgency for a planetary health framework to prevent the next pandemic and even more extensive human suffering. So the first focus area, the proximate determinants of this novel coronavirus. Here you can see an image of boys working on, they're skinning a wild animal. You can see close contact and easy opportunity for cross-species transmission. And we've all heard about these Chinese wet markets. There's actually, in China, wildlife is a natural resource. There's a wildlife protection law that's led to a domesticated wildlife industry, especially geared for small-scale farmers, peasant farmers. But when you stack wildlife up in this situation, it creates an unnatural environment for pathogens to spill over from one species to the other. And I'll define and talk about spillover very soon. But this is the near-term causal emergence of this novel coronavirus out of the wet markets. Where does coronavirus come from in the wild? Bats are the natural reservoir for SARS-like coronaviruses. And it's very important to understand the emergence of this last coronavirus. It was not by human intervention. For example, genetic studies of this virus show the mutations they definitely are not from human engineered manipulation. So it did not come from a laboratory. The mutations show evolutionary changes that are very consistent with cross-species transfer. And so when you have the bat virus come into contact with one of the most widely sold and endangered species from illegal picture of the pangolin, it's believed right now, the leading theory is that a bat coronavirus mixed with a pangolin coronavirus to lead to the current situation that we have right now. And unfortunately, you see this beautiful picture of a pangolin, but this is not a beautiful picture when you see this illegal wildlife trade. Apparently, they use the scales for medicinal reasons, and there's no actual scientific evidence that they really help with anything. But this is the unfortunate situation we're in. So let's go to ground zero. This is the seafood market in Wuhan, China. They were selling live wildlife and livestock along with fish. You had the spillover of these viruses, which we'll talk about shortly. And of course, from that location, you can see this, this map from, this is software from the EcoHealth Alliance, looking at flight paths for 1 week in January. And you can see that the virus spread around the world from international travel. And we all know the rest of the story. I will point out right here that from genetic analysis, most of the coronavirus in the United States looks like it actually came from Europe. So flights from Europe into New York and Chicago, as opposed to more of a China West Coast route. So that was the near-term, more obvious emergence of why we have this new coronavirus. Let's go upstream a little bit. Let's talk about the upstream causal factors, human incursions into and disruption of nature. And I saw this op-ed. I love the image of the forbidden fruit. And I like the title as well, what the coronavirus pandemic tells us about our relationship with the natural world. Of course, for us in Wisconsin, this is really old news. If we go back to Alda Leopold, professor at Wisconsin and government, and served in the government as well, he came up with the concept of the land ethic. When you look at a species or an individual, its health depends on the health of the land around it. So this already in his famous book, A Sand County Almanac, and the land ethic, where he's talking about interlinkage between healthy ecosystems and the health of species on which they depend. And of course, the famous naturalist John Muir, we can sort of claim him, Scottish, Wisconsin, California. Naturalist John Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And the interconnectedness of all of this is so front and center. So there are reports linking ecosystems, environmental sustainability, and human health. These are, I'm just going to show 3 of the reports that I have been involved with. This is the Millennium Ecosystem Report, Ecosystems and Human Wellbeing. Obama asked for a report from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the PCAST, in this report titled Sustaining Environmental Capital, Protecting Society and the Economy. And of course, the World Health Organization has come out with a report, Our Planet, Our Health, Our Future, looking at human health linked to biodiversity, climate change, and desertification. And something familiar to most of you on the line, that we've entered this new epoch. We're in the era of the Anthropocene, where humans are touching every part of the planet, and you can see, these rates, accelerating rates of greenhouse gases, CO2, deforestation, biodiversity loss, pollution, have been accelerating since the 1950s. So we're in this Anthropocene where we're really having an impact around the world. Land use change is probably the biggest cause of disease emergence. It's also the biggest threat to conservation, and it's a major driver of climate change. It drives economic growth, but there are trade-offs, and that's a problem. And you see emergence of diseases like malaria, Ebola virus. I'll talk later about Hendra virus. And of course, now we have this virus COVID-2 that's causing the COVID-19. Again, this is not, we published on this 16 years ago in a paper called Unhealthy Landscapes, and went over how land use change is affecting disease emergence around the world. And there are different types of land use change. This is looking at drivers and locations of emergence events for zoonotic infectious diseases. Zoonotic means coming from animals, mostly wildlife, but also domestic animals. So animal to human zoonotic diseases from 1940 to 2005. This paper published in Nature points out the different types of land use change. You can see the green and the yellow are all related to land use, agricultural intensification, and the food industry. You can see bushmeat hunting in the red and war. And you can see in parts of Africa, it's war-related. Also, this is other, and a lot of that other involves international travel, but also climate change. So it looks like sub-Saharan Africa, you've got issues of war, climate change, and bushmeat hunting. Whereas in other parts of the world, the greens and yellows show deforestation and agricultural aspects of land use change. Of course, antimicrobial agents in food supplies, that's also an issue that's problematic. So you can see these different types of drivers, and they differ around the world. But this is key to understand, that these are how we're disrupting the Earth's natural systems is, in fact, presenting risks through disease emergence. And my colleague, Dr. Peter Pasek, who's the director of the EcoHealth Alliance, he had this wonderful quote. I'll just read it. Pandemics are on the rise, and we need to contain the process that drives them, not just the individual diseases. Plagues are not only part of our culture, they are caused by it. Great quote from Peter Daszak. So I want to go even further as far as looking at this exchange between pathogens between animals and people. This is looking at a gel electrophoresis that sort of, it looks at DNA, and this is blood from African bushmeat hunters, and there is similarity between what they find in their own blood and what they find in non-human primates that they're hunting. And this dates back almost 20 years, a study showing that the majority of newly emerging diseases in humans are actually zoonoses, stemming from animals. Now, this next slide is probably the most important slide in this focus area of upstream determinants of emerging diseases. This comes from a colleague of mine, Professor Raina Plowright. And what I want you to notice, I'm going to go through these steps. And all of these things need to come into alignment in order for there to be a spillover event. And it's demonstrated by that blue bolt. And it's a rare event that happens, but it does happen when these all line up. When you look at the top, reservoir host distribution, think about when we deforest and we disrupt habitats. You know, reservoir species that may contain pathogens are forced to move. And then if we encroach more on their habitat, there may be an increase in wildlife density. The reservoirs that are carrying these parasites and viruses become higher density, which then affects the amount of pathogen. When you have more dense wildlife, there's more transmission, and the abundance, the prevalence of the pathogen increases. And we can talk about infection intensity when that happens. And then, you know, the reservoir hosts that are carrying these diseases will shed them more, you know, so pathogen release into the environment. Do the pathogens then survive? Do they spread? And lastly, or near lastly, are humans exposed to those pathogens? So the contact, you know, the edge effect between forest fragments and villages, or people going out into for bushmeat hunting or other practices, you know, the human exposure. And then are there barriers? Will that virus actually attach to a human cell? And that's where mutations and the recombination, and why the wet markets, when you combine across species and have mutations, maybe the protein that wouldn't normally attach to a human cell, there's a mutation. And so a bat virus or a pangolin virus or some other animal virus can then change and then attack humans. So there are all sorts of things that have to line up. And when they do line up, you see this spillover event, and you have animal pathogens that get into humans. And then if there's human-to-human spread, then we have a pandemic. So this is really important, and you can see how dealing with reservoir host distribution and density, that's a habitat issue. That's climate and deforestation and disrupting natural systems that is at the front end of this problem. And this is an example of different diseases and how far they get. You know, so for example, rabies, an infected animal that, you know, bites a human, that's secondary, that's stage 2 as far as animal to human spillover. Stage 3 is when an animal may infect a human that infects another human, but it's limited, it's a limited outbreak. like SARS and the Middle East respiratory syndrome. Human-human transmission after animal to human transmission, but didn't go very far. And then stage 4, you have a long outbreak. So COVID-19, definitely, we have, animal to human and now massive human-to-human infection, which is leading to a pandemic. If this is sustained over many years, then it becomes a stage 5 spillover event where it's only in humans, like HIV/AIDS. It came from non-human primates and also smallpox. So you can see these different levels of spillover. And right now, COVID-19, it looks like it's going to be here for a while. But you can understand this importance when you look at nature and species and spillover events. You can also get spillback of humans infecting gorillas, for example. This is what Tony Goldberg works on. This is actually a picture of my colleague, Professor Raina Plowright, and she's famous for her work on Hendra virus, a bat-borne virus in Australia. There were headlines, lots of horses were dying during this epidemic, and humans were also infected as well. The ecology is that the bats were roosting in trees, and they would be eating fruit, which would drop on the ground, and the horses would pick that up and get infected. And some of the horse handlers would then also get infected as well. Dr. Plowright's study found that it was widespread deforestation and fires across Indonesia that disrupted bat migration and increased bat density in urban parks and places where horses are found as well, horse paddocks. And these relationships have been known for a while. Veterinarians have taken a lead on this One Health movement. It's a framework to really understand these interlinkages between humans, domestic animals, and wildlife, and also the environment around that. So this is a very holistic approach that has been helping us understand these interlinkages. So One Health is something very high priority, and it's really an important effort as we move forward to really embrace the interdependence of these areas. One more example, another bat-borne virus, Nipah virus. One of our past students, Dr. Micah Hahn, a Nelson graduate and also Department of Population Health Sciences, did her thesis on this. This involves bees to collect sap. You can see the picture in the lower right pouring date palm. And this picture is in the upper right is fruit bats. So what do you think the connection is between tapping date palms and drinking the date palm sap and fruit bats? Well, this is a nighttime image. You can see the fruit bat feeding right out of the pot that's collecting the date sap. So, of course, they're now trying to cover those so this doesn't happen, but that was the link. And what Micah found in her study was that the area that was unique to Nipah virus in Bangladesh actually had more fragmented forest, higher human density, and more active bat roost. So again, an ecology, a disruption of the forest, an interplay between humans and a disturbed environment leading to this outbreak of Nipah virus. We've also worked in the Peruvian Amazon, and this is an image showing deforestation in the light green, but also now you can look at paved and unpaved roads and fires. We've studied what does that mean as far as disease risk. We've looked at malaria and deforestation. Malaria emerged in the Amazon following a rapid deforestation several decades ago. We looked at different levels of deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon. And we collected, this is work from Dr. Amy Vitor, who was featured in the cover image of this whole presentation. Dr. Amy Vitor led this study where she captured the dangerous mosquito, Anopheles darlingi, that carries malaria in that area. And after controlling for human population density, we found an increase in the abundance and biting of this dangerous mosquito. A subsequent student of the University of Wisconsin, the Department of Population Health Sciences, and the Nelson Institute, Dr. Sarah Olson, followed up on this study and found that for every 1% of deforestation, the incidence rate, or the new cases of malaria, increased by 11%. So we also have problems with climate change, and I want to talk a little bit about climate change risks to the environment. These are the physical attributes of climate change: rising temperatures, sea level rise, and extremes of the water cycle, more droughts, floods, and fires. And of course, throughout, if you look at those three parameters, they cut across these different exposure pathways that lead to all of these different climate-sensitive diseases. And this lecture is not about climate change and health. I've given that one many, many times. But I do want to point out that part of the story of climate change and health is that of infectious diseases, especially insect and rodent-borne diseases, or vector-borne diseases, and waterborne diseases. And it is thought that global warming's greatest threat may also be the smallest, because that mosquito is a cold-blooded animal. And whatever the air temperature is surrounding that mosquito, that is her body temperature. And if she's carrying dangerous parasites, the air temperature completely dictates the rate of development and biting rates as well. And so climate has a huge influence on transmission dynamics of these insect-borne diseases. This mosquito species, the Aedes aegypti, is the species that carries yellow fever, dengue, and Zika virus. Dengue fever is the most prevalent mosquito-borne virus in the world. And it's seasonal, it comes in different seasons. And working with my colleague, Dan Weimont in the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research, I asked him to take a look at temperatures in South America during that very strong El Nino event in the winter of 2015. And he showed that the temperatures actually were more than 2 standard deviations above a constructed normal. Hello?
Nope,
Emily,
everything should be fine. I'm not sure what that was.
Okay, sorry. Everything clear?
Yes, it looks good.
Thank you. Okay. So Dan Weimont constructed a 60-year average, and this extreme temperature was more than 2 standard deviations above that 60-year average. Studies looking at the ability of that mosquito, Aedes aegypti, to transmit virus, this is called the vectorial capacity. So the ability, the climate suitability of that mosquito transmitting Zika and dengue transmission. Right before that Zika epidemic emerged, was at the highest level in the past 60 years. In other words, the climate suitability made it very favorable for transmission of dengue and Zika virus, because Zika is in the same family as dengue. But something else that's unique from laboratory studies of Zika virus, the predicted thermal minimum for Zika transmission is 5 degrees centigrade warmer than that of dengue fever. So the question is, did the extreme hot temperatures have something to do with this brand new emergence, or actually resurgence, of Zika virus? Of course, it's a complicated story. International travel was involved, but it is a question that is out there, that did this extreme climate have at least played some role in the emergence of Zika virus? So now in my last focus area, I want to look at planetary health. and this framework as a key path forward to prevent the next pandemic. Because if I paraphrase Aldo Leopold, we now vividly realize our own health is inextricably linked to the health of ecosystems. And when you see this recent surge in deforestation in the Amazon just from this year, I question, what will that risk be? But I want to show this image. I'm sure that almost all of you have seen these op-eds and these stories coming out of the silver lining of our current pandemic. When the global economy has shut down, and you look at this image from New Delhi, India, and you compare the before and after the pandemic air quality, what could be any clearer comparing today's air quality with business as usual? And remember that air pollution causes 7 million premature deaths every year, according to the World Health Organization. We've seen satellite images of nitrogen dioxide. Dr. Tracy Holloway works on satellite images to detect air pollution, and there are studies around the world right now. Look at these satellites. This is comparing January from February, nitrogen dioxide over China, just dropping like a stone. Look at this comparison in France and other parts of Europe, comparing March of 2019 with March of 2020, looking at, less nitrogen dioxide in the air. Look at our own country, March 2019 to March 2020. And look at this from these big mega cities in India. When's the last time that they had a clean, good green air quality rating? So my big question, at this time, this particular time, do we really want to uncork the conventional, dangerous fossil fuel economy? Especially when you look at this recent report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where the IPCC was asked, what would it take to stabilize the Earth's climate at just 1.5 degrees centigrade warming and not go beyond that when it becomes quite dangerous for ecosystems and our health? Well, the answer from the IPCC was that to stabilize at just 1.5 degrees warming, we need to cut our emissions from burning fossil fuels and also from cutting rainforests, but mostly burning fossil fuels. We need to cut emissions 45% in 10 years and get to net zero by 2020 really soon. So this is urgent. And I worry though, right now with our current pandemic, and shutting down the global economy as a solution, will people fear the trade-off of solving another global crisis? But unlike COVID-19, I strongly feel that, combating climate change could be free or even a net gain. I've been on this soapbox for over 5 years, 6 years looks like, publishing on climate change challenges and opportunities for global health. Solving the global climate crisis, the greatest health opportunity of our times. Just over a month ago, publishing with 2 former students of ours, a low carbon future could improve global health and achieve economic benefit. Look at the cost of clean energy. If you were to invest in cleaner energy to avoid emitting 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, it might cost up to $30. Actually, with Greg Nemet's recent book on why solar got so cheap, it's probably even less than this. But let's take it at $30 or so to avoid emitting 1 ton of CO2. Well, every time you burn coal and oil, you emit not only greenhouse gases, but you also emit dangerous pollutants, fine particles, PM 2.5, sulfur dioxide, other hazardous pollutants that we know harm our health. So for every 1 ton of CO2 that you avoid emitting, how much less PM 2.5 would be in the air? And when you look at that reduction in fine particles, what is the health benefit from avoided deaths, hospitalizations, and illness and absenteeism? On average, globally, we're talking $200 in health benefit for every ton of CO2 avoided. And I asked policymakers, which number is bigger? And it's so important that we recognize how enormous these health benefits are from clean air, and especially in places, other parts of the world that are even more polluted than the United States, even far greater benefits. So the enormity of the opportunity upon us is just incredible, and we need to seize this moment. Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, and now the chair of the elders, along with Dana Reddy, put out this op-ed recently, tackling climate change with COVID-19 urgency. And Christiana Figueres of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change published this op-ed. We can't lose sight of the climate emergency as we're dealing with COVID-19. And I love this image. Why don't we treat climate change like an infectious disease? Because after all, climate change is a global health emergency. And recognizing this, the Nelson Institute and the Global Health Institute, along with partners across the university, have started a new program, the Planetary Health Graduate Scholars Program. As I mentioned, this is joint between the Global Health and the Nelson Institutes. We just started at the beginning of this year with 6 graduate students from across the campus and their faculty advisors. And just, I think it was last week, we announced 8 new graduate scholars and their mentors. And this program comes from a generous donation from Sarah and Dave Epstein. So we're very appreciative of these donations for this extremely timely program. One other project that we're working on, we are quantifying the health benefits from a low carbon society. Project Drawdown is led by John Foley, a former professor here at the Nelson Institute. And right now, this is a collaboration with 3 Nelson graduate students. And these funds come from the John P. Holton Chair, along with a new donor from Wisconsin. So we are looking at these environmental solutions and quantifying how beneficial they are for our health, deepening the rationale to take these actions. So in conclusion, in the middle of an environmentally linked global pandemic, we have the opportunity of a lifetime to seize the moment for a transformative change. And on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, if not now, when? Thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. Over to you, Paul.
I hear thunderous applause from your 616 participants out there.
Wow.
Echoing in silence, but they're out there. So when the applause dies down, we'll go to Q&A. We have lots of questions. I'm going to try to bundle them, so I'm not going to take them in the order they came in because they're different kinds of questions. The first ones go to the question of North America. You had a map from the Nature article, which showed differential sources of the disease, right, by region with little circles.
Mm-hmm.
The North America circle was the largest. The question is that just because we have a big population, or actually do we have a, I want to be able to interpret that map properly. I had that question, so did a couple of people out there in the audience. While we're at it, you might ask or answer a question, you may not know the answer to this. are there examples of where deforestation in the US historically, I mean, we had the great cutover in the northern part of this country, right in this state, right, has created transmission of diseases from wildlife to humans, or is this something that we don't see in the US? So the first question is really North America. What's North America's role as a reservoir of environmentally driven health hazards?
Right, right. Well, some of those circles were larger in Europe and in the United States. And even while these researchers were trying to control for the number of publications, I still think there's a bit of a reporting bias, that we have fewer actual scientific studies coming out of Africa and in developing countries. So even though they tried to control for that, I think there is a bit of a reporting bias there. The other issue is our food systems. We have a very high level of antibiotics that we put in animal feed. So I think that's a problem. As far as your question about deforestation, we have transformed the US landscape. And of course, there's this big story of Lyme disease and reforestation and habitat fragmentation. Lyme disease is quite complicated, actually, but that is something where, habitat fragments, where you have, for example, an intact forest with lots of biodiversity. The primary reservoir for Lyme disease is a white-footed mouse. And when you have an intact ecosystem with lots of ferrets and foxes and eagles and hawks and a big food chain, you don't have that many mice around. Whereas when you chop up a forest into pieces and you have small fragments that don't support those predators and rich biodiversity, in many of these small fragments, you have plenty of mice. Mice can live everywhere. And then put that small forest fragment up against an agricultural field where you may have, and that's a nice habitat for deer, this sort of forest agriculture edges. You have that fragmented system, and you've got deer, mice, and, I'm sorry, not deer mice, but mice and deer, white-footed mice and deer. Deer mice, that's another story. That's the hantavirus in the Southwest, and that's an El Nino climate change story. But let's get back to Lyme disease. White-footed mice and deer, if you have that situation, your mouse population goes way up. Mice are the main reservoir. And so this is a story of reduced biodiversity because of habitat fragmentation, leading to higher risk of Lyme disease.
Great. So that goes a little bit to sort of the geography of this problem. There was a question about history. Outside of the spread from European settlers to natives, of course, that catastrophe of white settlement in this country in terms of the disease rate in native populations. Leaving that aside, are there historical incidences of land use change causing emergence of infectious diseases? Lyme disease is very recent. In other words, in history, do we have some evidence of this, or archaeology, or is this a specifically contemporary phenomenon?
Well, you go back to, the Crusades and the explorers, and stories that go way back as far as introducing, smallpox. You go back to the plague. The plague came from, business travelers, and so it was a matter of international commerce. So plague, smallpox, all of these things go back to human activity. And so we have many examples, even domesticating, cows, that led to smallpox and measles. So we go back very, very far. And then some of the newer issues of, for example, HIV/AIDS, that is linked back to non-human primates, and some of these other diseases that I talked about more contemporarily. But yes, for sure, this has been throughout history. And of course, avian influenza after World War I, and that issue linked to international travel. And again, that's a story of sort of, this recombination of avian flu with domesticated animals that led to a pathogen that could then bind to human receptors, when normally a normal avian, a bird flu or swine flu wouldn't normally bind to receptors in the human lung. But when you have that mixing in these different species, and you get mutations and a new strain that actually is dangerous and can link to human cells, that's when you have a problem. Of course, the Spanish flu of 1918 is our biggest, the biggest thing in history that's related to our current pandemic.
Great, thank you. That was super helpful. Really quick one here. You showed us deforestation rates in the Amazon. I know our own Holly Gibbs here at the Nelson Institute and the Department of Geography works on tracking deforestation rates to see if we can maintain a kind of no net deforestation, which is supported by a lot of international foundations. But we get this bump in 2020, which was just crazy big after a decade of doing better. Can you speak to that at all? What drove that quick bump and that scary bump?
Right. Well, this is where I would defer to the experts in conservation and the ecologists and the political scientists to look at the deforestation policy and conservation. That's in their camp. But what I will say is that from what we now know about the links of deforestation and from our own studies, risk of malaria increasing with deforestation and other diseases that emerge from this problem. I wonder if when you see a surge like that in deforestation, that's not only ecocide, but is it homicide? Because we know what's going to happen next. So this is where that type of destruction of natural ecosystems becomes unconscionable, because we now know of these very strong links between the health of our ecosystems and our own health.
Great. Okay, so now we have two linked questions, which I think are kind of interesting. Agriculture, contributes to deforestation as much or more than any other cause. Most of that due to meat production. I'm not entirely, I think that's a regionally variable, I want to say that, but certainly a lot of it to do with meat production, certainly the Amazonian case. The cattle industry is an important player. One question, should we just go to a plant-based diet? The other one is, actually though, should we be facilitating a transition to domesticated meat in the developing world? Or is it just hopeless and everybody should just eat plants?
Right.
So
Yeah.
two separate questions. One person was asking, do we in developing contexts where we see a lot of this bushmeat, wouldn't it be better to have Tyson? And the other point is, can we get past Tyson altogether? Right.
So those are great questions. I'll just point out one quick thing about bushmeat hunting, which is direct transfer of non-primates viruses into humans. A couple of things, that's a very small issue when you look at our food system. So these are even bigger, better questions. And, I think that when you deal with developing poor countries, of course, livestock are very important and micronutrients are important. So for poor countries, for sure, there's a role for livestock. But for wealthier countries, where we overconsume red meat is the most damaging for the environment when you look at feedstocks, water, energy that's used to produce a kilogram of protein from red meat. It's the most damaging to the environment. And it's pretty damaging for our cardiovascular systems, heart attack, stroke, and cancer as well. So, there are great incentives from the environmental and health reasons to get away from red meat. And we, certainly, I think that would be one step that we can take. Do we go fully with a plant-based diet? I think for sure it's a win-win if we can get more of our protein from legumes and we get to more of a plant-based diet. But I also do know farmers, especially in Wisconsin, that have sometimes said it's more about the how than the how, so that in limited areas or limited extent, can we have dairy? Can we have red meat? I think the answer is probably, but we need to do it right and sustainably, and certainly scale it back and push more towards a plant-based diet. And so what we can do for the global environment when you look at these different drivers of disease emergence and, biodiversity loss and climate change. Yes, we need to decrease the amount of red meat we consume, but I don't necessarily, I'm not pushing that everyone in the world becomes vegan.
Okay, I'm going to take two quick ones and just answer them. One is, will this thing be available, what we just saw presented? And the answer is yes. We're recording this session, so it will be made available later this week, I believe. Emily Reynolds can answer that question, but I believe it'll be available for you to use in classrooms or wherever else.
Yes,
the second question
correct.
is, when is UW going back to face-to-face? And it's $1 million question. And I can tell you that Dr. Patz is actually on the committee that is discussing what it would have to look like to make that work. So we don't know the answer to that, but smart people are thinking about it. Anything you want to say about that?
I'll just say that this afternoon we are having our first UW System Emergency Operations Command meeting. And so we're going to be working across all the campuses in Wisconsin to figure out not only when, but more importantly, how to try to reopen in the fall. And it's going to be lots of thought is going to go into it. The key is to do it in a safe way, and we want to figure out, we're going to be taking best ideas from all over the country and all over the world, how to do this safely.
Great. Really quickly, what is UW-Madison's role in the effort with Google and Apple to implement contact tracing? So you mentioned that briefly.
So yesterday, the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, the DHS, had an all-day meeting on contact tracing. They're working on a gap analysis to figure out how the University of Wisconsin might help them, be it from cell phone technology. We did see that agreement between Google and Apple. We've got experts. Professor Song Gao is an expert in cell phone technology. And the key is to have a firewall to protect confidential information. That's paramount. And that's something that the university knows how to do. So the university will be helping DHS as they come to us any day now, the next day or two, on gap analysis to say how we can help them, including our Department of Information Technology, do it. Todd Schechter, who's the head of Do It, has been involved with this. So I think the university will be doing a fair amount, but we wait for DHS and the governor to ask us specifically how to help them. There may be some asks of the business school to ask them how to, or to direct them to companies to help contact tracing. The DHS is estimating that we need 1,000 people that are 100% dedicated and paid for contact tracing. It is it's a Herculean task, contact tracing, but it has to be done. So we are working with the DHS. We are at their service. So lots of resources on campus and lots of smart people.
Another kind of question in that vein, what's the best place to get real-time data for students to use and analyze on the pandemic? Is it CDC? Where do you go for data sets to work with?
Well, I would first start with, I don't have the website handy, but we have a COVID research group. There's a website, probably if you just Googled UW-Madison COVID-19 research group, there's a homepage that has all of the best national dashboards from Hopkins, from University of Washington, from all over, and then our own data dashboards. So if you go to COVID-19 research group here on campus, there are incredible links. I would start there. And that group has been led by Dr. Brian Yandel, the director of the American Family Insurance Data Science Institute. And there have been, on our phone calls every noon, more than 100 volunteer faculty, staff, and students that have come on to those phone calls every day.
Great. And somebody volunteered also that obviously Johns Hopkins GitHub has data available as well. Hopkins obviously has been tracking this from the start. There's a couple more questions. I'm not sure. There's just so many. I think we'll leave you with the sort of most platitudinous opportunity, which is to say, what should the average citizen out there, based on what we know, be doing? Should they be working at the community level? Is it more important to work at the national policy level, the global level? I know there's no answer to that question, but based on your own experience, is there any words of wisdom that you would give to the audience about where to make a difference and be a change maker?
Right. Okay. Well, I will start proximally, and I'll start just by saying two other local efforts that are happening. One is that a cell phone app that's been used for the opioid epidemic is now being used for helping people get through this. It's an app that was developed actually by John Holton and Professor Dave Gustafson in the Chess Health group. So that's one near-term thing, and you could get that app and not get depressed and help get through this. Another thing is that through a combined effort between the Global Health Institute, the University Alliance, which includes the Nelson Institute, and the Morgridge Center, there's been a communications campaign on strategic communications on physical distancing. And with that, I'll tell people, after I take a quick sip, that one of the most important things that we can all do is to follow the governor's safer at home or wherever you're located. If you don't have a governor's executive order, please stay at home and be separate. The virus needs to find another warm body for this epidemic to continue. So really practicing strict physical distancing, stay socially connected through the internet, but physically distance, absolutely. Personal hygiene, so really do wash your hands a lot. And so that's sort of the near term. We have to continue to do that. We need to support those that have more difficulty when they're staying at home. I think we can donate to food pantries and try to support those people that are struggling more than many of us. So you can tap into those local donations and support in that way. Finally, be aware that as we come out of this, it's going to be phased, and it's definitely not going to be flipping a switch. It's going to be a slow return to not even normal, but closer to normal activity. And finally, the theme of this presentation is to not solely focus on this one crisis that we saw coming for a long time. We need to absolutely get to the root of the problem, understand that we have to get away from the, neglect, respond, repeat type of mentality. We need to go upstream at these upstream determinants that we now see are also environmental issues. We need to conserve natural areas. We need to stabilize our climate. We need to take this opportunity, this crisis, as an opportunity to look at a new low carbon economy with clean energy and with preserving our natural ecosystems. So that is my final concluding statement on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day.
That's great. You couldn't have done it any better, wrapping it up. That is where we're going to leave it. I'm sure if the 600 some odd people out there could thank you with applause, they would. I would just like to add a huge shout out of thanks to Emily Reynolds, who organized this whole conference. Go check out all the other recorded materials. Be at 3 o'clock Central Time at the chat room, where you'll be able to talk with many of the speakers that you can't interact with, like Jonathan here in real time. So thanks again, Dr. Patz. Thanks to everybody. I'm so proud to work here. All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye. Thank you.